Britain has an ancient history, with their origins going back to the Romans. Today we're going to cram all of that history into just 10 minutes. Let's get started. 43 AD. Roman invasion under Emperor Claudius. Julius Caesar had tried invading Britain earlier, but failed. However, his uncle, Emperor Claudius, was having none of that. He sent a large force over to Britain led by Aulus Plautus. They finally conquered the island, although some historians debate how far their invasion really went. The conquering of Britain was a huge propaganda victory for Rome, and Claudius was keen to take advantage of it. He visited Britain in person, built new cities, and even set up a mint to produce British coins. The province of Britannia was officially established and would go on to be a vital part of the Roman Empire for centuries. But the Romans weren't the first people to inhabit the island. Even before their arrival, there were several different tribes living in Britain. Some of them even spoke a language related to modern Welsh, Cornish, and Breton. But as you can probably guess, these tribes didn't stand much of a chance against the Roman war machine. And so the locals were subjected to Roman rule. Many of them rebelled, though, like Boudica, queen of the Iceni tribe. Her husband had been a loyal ally of Rome, but when he died, Rome ignored his pleas for his widow and children to succeed him, leading Boudica to lead a major rebellion against the occupier. Although her revolt ultimately failed, it left a lasting impression on the people of Britain and the empire itself. Meanwhile, across the North Sea, a new threat was emerging: the Anglo-Saxons. These Germanic tribes began raiding the coasts of Britain in the 3rd century, and eventually they began to settle there as well. This was partly due to the weakening of the Roman Empire, which wasn't able to defend its far-flung provinces anymore. By the 5th century, most of the Roman institutions had collapsed in Britain, and the island was largely abandoned by Rome. The Angles, Saxons, and Jutes were now free to conquer the island without any interference from the south. Now, these Germanic tribes didn't wipe out the native Britons. In fact, many of them adopted the Celtic languages and customs of the locals. But this wasn't true for everyone. During the 6th and 7th centuries, the Anglo-Saxons established 7 kingdoms along the east coast. In the west, however, the Britons held on, and this resulted in a sort of cultural border between the two peoples. Even today, if you look at Wales, Cornwall, and the Isle of Man, you can see how the native Britons managed to survive, largely due to the geographical barriers that protected them. But while the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were constantly warring with each other, one of them stood out from the rest: Wessex. Under the rule of Alfred the Great, Kingdom of Wessex managed to repel a full-scale invasion from the Danes, who were also known as Vikings. In fact, Alfred even went on the offensive and conquered much of northern Britain. This gave England, as it was now called, some breathing room from the Danish invaders. But it was only a matter of time until the next Viking army arrived. And indeed, during the 9th and 10th centuries, the Northmen continued to terrorize the English. But by this point, the English were more prepared for the invasions and fought back with ferocity. After years of fighting, both sides agreed to stop the bloodshed and convert the Northmen to Christianity. This worked pretty well too. Soon after, King Canute, the Great of England. Denmark and Norway converted to Christianity and became friends with the English nobles. His successors, however, were less friendly, and the following decades saw another wave of Danish invasions. This time, the English decided to fight back. Under the leadership of Edward the Confessor, the English were able to push back the Danes once again. But after his death, the throne was taken by Harold Godwinson, a powerful English earl. This didn't sit well with William, Duke of Normandy, who believed that he had been promised the throne by Edward. So when Harold became king, William invaded. This invasion is famously known as the Norman Conquest, and completely changed the course of English history. The Normans were able to defeat the English at the Battle of Hastings, and Harold died soon afterwards. Now, the Normans weren't actually Norman at this point. That wouldn't happen until they invaded Sicily and southern Italy in the 11th century. For our purposes, they were basically just French. And with the conquest complete, the new Norman king, William the Conqueror, began introducing Norman customs, language, and culture to England. Some of this was accepted rather peacefully, like the introduction of the English shire system. But other changes were not, like the heavy taxation that William imposed on the English populace. There were also revolts in Wales and Scotland, which were put down with brutal force. But while William was busy suppressing revolts and collecting taxes, the English church was growing in power. Under the reign of Henry II, the English church became a formidable institution. It developed a legal system of its own and even created the office of the Lord Chancellor. Henry's son, Richard the Lionheart, spent more time fighting in France than actually ruling England, so the day-to-day running of the country fell onto the shoulders of the English barons and church officials. However, Richard's brother, John Lackland, wanted more power for himself and less for the English barons. This eventually led to the signing of the Magna Carta in 1215. This document is often referred to as the cornerstone of British liberty. But in reality, it was just a list of grievances against King John and what he owed his barons. That being said, it did limit royal power and did help establish the idea that the king is not above the law. The following centuries saw the rise of a new royal dynasty in Britain. The Plantagenet era brought peace and prosperity to the kingdom, especially during the reign of Edward III. This king was famous for his victories on the battlefield, particularly at the Battle of Crécy, where the English longbow destroyed the French nobility. Unfortunately for Edward, he had no heir when he died, so the throne passed to his grandson Richard II. Richard had a bit of a reputation for being a spoiled brat, throwing tantrums whenever he didn't get his way. This made him very unpopular with the English nobility, who deposed him in favor of his uncle, Henry Bolingbroke. Henry took the throne as Henry V. Henry's reign saw the end of the Plantagenet dynasty and the beginning of the House of Lancaster. But it also saw a renewed conflict with France, this time over the French throne itself. However, the English claim to the French throne had little merit, and Henry's wars in France were costly and unsuccessful. The 100 Years' War would go on for another century after Henry's death, ending in 1453 with the capture of the city of Castellon. During the late Middle Ages, Britain was shaken by a series of peasant revolts. Perhaps most notably the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. The Wat Tyler Uprising sought to end serfdom and improve the lives of the poor. But after Tyler's death, the revolt was crushed and the peasants went back to work. Social and economic change was slow during the Middle Ages, and there was still a lot of poverty and inequality. But then the Renaissance rolled around. Just like in mainland Europe, the Renaissance introduced new ideas about art, literature, and science to Britain. The most famous writer of the English Renaissance was William Shakespeare, whose plays are still performed all around the world today. But perhaps even more important than Shakespeare was King Henry VIII. This monarch broke with the Roman Catholic Church and established the Church of England with himself as its head. Henry's daughter, Mary Tudor, tried to return England to Catholicism, but she was unsuccessful. Instead, England became more and more Protestant under her successor, Elizabeth I. During her reign, England defeated the Spanish Armada and became a major player on the world stage. However, England was still far from being a global superpower. That would only happen with the British Empire. So let's speed things up a bit. Elizabeth's successor, James I, also became the King of Scotland, uniting the two crowns of England and Scotland for the first time. The following century saw the American Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. With Britain emerging victorious from both conflicts, this period of time also saw the start of the Industrial Revolution in Britain, which would transform the nation into a massive colonial empire stretching across the globe. In the 20th century, Britain would lose its empire and decolonize most of its holdings. But that didn't mean that Britain was done with the world. In the aftermath of World War II, Britain joined the United Nations and helped found the European Union. It also played a major role in both the Suez Crisis and the Cold War. Today, Britain is part of the Western world and a close ally of the United States. It has a constitutional monarchy with a prime minister as its head of government. The country is divided into 4 constituent countries: England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. All 4 have their own distinct cultures, but together they make up the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Thank you for watching.